All right. We have finished our reading of Hamlet. We have finished our running commentary and discussion that is incidental to the text. Now what remains are the larger matters, the things behind the whole of the work. With Hamlet, we will see that there are several very large mythical themes, and they're ponderous and carry great gravity about them. What also remains to be done is to see how this play fits into the greater themes, the themes of the cycles of Christ and Persephone, and to try to understand that cycle now that we have completed one round of it in an unusual fashion. Even though we're being somewhat brief and superficial, it's going to take more than one talk, because there's a considerable amount of information yet to be done. Ultimately, it'll take 3 talks. Now, about the time these notes were composed, a friend and I were conversing, and I noted that there were several causes of melancholy and depression that were not brought up in a list of causes. At least not in the causes of Hamlet's depression. But that, we realize we can't do everything. Hamlet couldn't do everything. He had a good number of seeds of depression in his psychology, but he didn't have all of them, and it would be kind of diversive to follow out or to bring in causes of depression that Hamlet didn't have. It would also be irrelevant and superfluous to discuss them. We've been on the fringes of some of these questions along the way, but we haven't addressed them directly. Questions about Hamlet and things that we want to understand as aspiring Christian mystics. Now, one of these questions can be phrased in several ways, and each one of them takes us very deeply into human psycho-spirituality makeup. We have noted several causal symptoms in the depression of Hamlet. They're valid in terms of psychology, but we have not asked whether it is possible that one individual could have so many forms or means to depression, except as a fictitious stage character. So that is, we have not asked, is Hamlet a real character? Or is he even a psychologically possible character? We can do a lot of things in writing that can't be done in reality. That these questions lead to other questions, like what kind of behavior turns into such a character? And that ultimately leads to an ultimate question: who is Hamlet? One can come to that ultimate question from entirely different directions. Each direction has a series of questions about it that leads you to the character of Hamlet. We're following, at this point in this talk, we're following a psychological direction. We'll take mythological and other things later on. So let's look at some of the series of questions that lead to who is Hamlet. First one is Hamlet insane? And that question depends on another. What is sanity or insanity? And we know he's depressive, So we have to ask, when does depression become insanity? And then that gets us to the question, who is Hamlet to be so depressed? And we're going to try to answer some of these questions in this talk, but there will be 2 more talks to answer most of the rest of them that we don't answer this evening. One of the most commonly accepted tests of sanity is rationality. Sometimes, instead of asking if someone is sane, we ask, is he or is she rational? There's a lot to be questioned of that criterion for sanity. For example, if a person is signing some legal papers like a will or a power of attorney or something like that, there's often a statement, I, Richard Koepsel, being of sound body and mind. And this is meaning to say that the person who's making out the will or the declaration of one kind or another is sane. But even an insane person could make that same statement. I know plenty of people that are or have been insane, and most of them are convinced that they are mentally sound. Others are so far out, they don't even know the question. And yet there are others that don't even think there is such a state as sanity or insanity. Now, if we were to follow this definition of strictness, absolute strictness, like the gravedigger in the last act of Hamlet, stupid and idiotic people would be insane because they're not rational. Now, there may be something to that, but that's not what we mean when we're looking at insanity. Moreover, some of the most sane people that I've ever encountered didn't all exhibit linear logic or ratiocination. Some of them are para-rational. If we take a historical example, the ecstatic poets, like Rumi, for example, they're not rational, or they're super-rational, but they're certainly sane, even though they're called mad poets, and they're much more sane than most people. Now that itself is an interesting concept. More or less sane. Is sanity relative? Is it possible to be more sane or less sane than another? Or is it a matter that it's like pregnancy? Either one is pregnant or not pregnant. One can't be a little bit pregnant or more pregnant. It's either you're pregnant or you're not. Now, some would say that there are varying degrees and varieties of insanity, like saying he is more crazy than she is, but only one kind of sanity, because something is rational, it's rational. Sometimes it's possible to see the inverse of that there are varying degrees of sanity, people who are seeing things as they are and seeing much more in them than others, but only one insanity, and that one insanity can be arrived at in many ways. So the issue that we're looking at here is not a real simple issue, and a lot of very, very astute people have addressed it and have come to very different conclusions. Now, if we take the rationality definition, then the more intelligent someone is, And the more logic that someone uses, the more sane they would be. Usually the more intelligent someone is, the more logic they use. But are they more sane? I don't think so. Now, I think that there are people who are more sane than others, but intelligence is not the factor that leads to it. Usually it is some kind of humility that sees things for what they are and not being personally bound up in the judgment of it. Now, there are some, more often men than women, and more often scientific or technical, that have a opinion, and it's quite a common prejudice, that because they are rational and strictly rational, they're more sane than other people. This is really a big discrimination against people who have feelings. Feelingful people and artists are people who suffer from this kind of discrimination. Now, Hamlet is certainly a rational individual. However, Polonius or Rosencrantz or Osric might not think so, because they're not intelligent enough or cannot reach far enough to know whether he is rational or sane. And in this matter, it's an interesting thing to think. It seems possible that Shakespeare might be toying with us in this same way. There are things about Hamlet that make us wonder whether he is sane, and also whether his rationalities and Shakespeare's rationality might exceed ours so much that we're being toyed with, perhaps for our own good. That's what creative artists do. They bring us to experiences that we understand ourselves and the world in a better way. Hamlet did a lot of toying with characters in the play, and maybe the playwright is doing the same with us. Now, when we observed Ophelia in her psychological distress, we noticed that her statements were not irrational either. But she probably was insane and certainly was out of control. She used a much different rationale than the world uses, but it was not irrational. We could see when we read through that part and commented on it, we could see that there was a logic to it, but it was a different language. Her logic had to do with the inner worlds, which the psychologists would call the unconscious. From all of this, we can see that there is something of rationality or lucidity that is involved in sanity, but exactly what, it's not clear. And we can see also that it's clearly not the single thing that determines sanity or insanity or degree of sanity or insanity. We have not really determined yet whether there is a relative scale of sanity or insanity. These are all questions we might not even answer all of them in this talk or even in the succeeding talks, but it is something that we do need to question. I think because insanity is almost pandemic. I think in the Society of the United States, I think at least 1 in 10 people has to undergo psychotherapy of some type in their life. All right. We are, in a large-scale mystical sense, trying to answer the question, who is Hamlet? Along the way, and building toward that answer, we're trying to answer some other questions, such as, is Hamlet a psychologically possible character or only a fictitious stage character? question can be put another way, is can so many depressive factors actually exist in one personality? For example, last time we saw at the graveside that Hamlet did have strong feelings for Ophelia, but that the even stronger mind kept them in check and repressed them. At that time we said that was the very personality type that results in depression. That is, when the head gets way ahead of the better feelings, without support, there's often a tendency for the mind to see how bad it is. And especially if it is focused on material things, where humans have made a mess of things and it's easy to become preoccupied in the world of objects. There's more to it than that. There is a general or basic factor of depression carried to its extreme in insanity in that fact. It is imbalance. In folk language, we say that if someone is insane or that they are psychologically or mentally unbalanced or troubled, we say they're off their rocker. We're not trying to equate all depression or melancholy with insanity, nor are we trying to say that all psychological balance is insanity. Depression and imbalance, if deep enough, can be sufficient factors in insanity, but that usually isn't the case. Melancholy isn't always melancholia. There's a difference, and it is a matter of degree. We're also not trying to imply that imbalance by itself means depression, which is absurd, because if the circumstances were reversed and the feelings were stronger than the mind, and they were jovial feelings, we would have a pure manic character with no depression. Such characters as pure maniacs are more rare than depressives, and there are physical limits to mania, perhaps more than there are to depression, but such people do exist. The speaker has known several of them, one especially that he marveled at. All right. Last time we mentioned the theory of repressed anger as the basis for depression, which is a theory that some psychologists go by. Now, vengeance is certainly a description of repressed or suppressed anger. Smoldering, festering, it builds up with each new supposed insult. Now, if Hamlet's melancholy is indeed intense enough to mean insanity, it is this factor, in my mind, that would be the telling point of his sanity or insanity. He repeatedly stated that he needed to avenge his father's murder. That's close enough to being sufficiently irrational to question his sanity. Obviously, vengeance is irrational and it's not healthy. But again, we have to state, just for the record, that he is equating justice with vengeance. It's not always a personal thing for him, though he does have some of that also. For that matter, his careless disregard for responsibility, like his careless disregard for the death of Polonius, which was not murder, it was manslaughter, he maintained for a while this cavalier attitude about it, which would seem symptomatic if it weren't part of his feigning. That's the big thing here, the feigning. Anger, because of its extremely energetic or bursting quality, in its repression is the most likely emotion that is to be suppressed, leading to depression. In fact, some people believe anger is the basic emotion of all emotions because it is motive and it moves us, which is the purpose of our motive being. Any emotion, if repressed, could cause depression. This is because all emotions are live. All emotions have a vital nature to them. And it takes a very strong agency to suppress them. When they are suppressed, they can metamorphose and eventually be metamorphosed into that basic emotion of anger. It's almost like geological activity, where hard stone gets pressed deeper and deeper into the crust of the earth until it gets the heat from the core and becomes molten, and it becomes metamorphosed. The agency that does the suppressing or repressing or depressing is known by clairvoyants who are also astrologically trained is Saturnian. Saturn is the lord of depression. But Saturn also sees the appearances. And whether in fear or hatred or selfishness, it will do anything to maintain the appearances, especially if it can be done simply by suppression or repression. In the case of Hamlet, Saturn works through the mind and intensifies the control which the mind exercises over the desire nature. We have looked at other theories of the cause of depression as it relates to the general personality of Hamlet, such as the general case of being depressed or repressed because one needs to go deeper. In the most general sense, in generic causality, Saturn is the correct answer there also. By this theory, in terms of destiny and character growth, depression is used to promote depth. Depression means to push down. Astrologically, Saturn represents depth. Where we have it, or where we need it, or where we're developing it, is indicated by Saturn in the horoscope. And it will not allow us to move on to something else, some other development in character, until we have learned the lesson that is needed sufficiently enough to move forward. Until we get deep, until we get to the bottom of it, it pushes us, holds us down until we get it. So it's something of a cosmic depression to the ever buoyant spirit of life, which always tries to express itself, and it suffers when it is stymied. And that's where the depressiveness comes in. Now, there are many ways to be deep, and hopefully we'll be able to look at several of them. In these talks, we have been looking at Hamlet as though he were something like a modern spiritual aspirant. He is modern in that his quest has been highly intellectual and educated, so much so that he has developed an unbalanced character. He is modern in that he is tediously self-conscious, self-absorbed, preoccupied in his own life and the things he has to do. He's worked at this primarily through the mind, and his self-centered thought about all of the reasons to not do the things he knows he has to do. The mind, that self-centered mind, has sickly, to use his word, is resolved to do his duty. Most people just think of all kinds of alibis. He ponders things very deeply. This is very much a Saturn-Mercury mind. He has experienced superphysical things. He's interacted with a ghost. He has either an extraordinary intuition or an ability to read minds, or both, and he's demonstrated that several times in the play. He has intimated otherworldly philosophies in several places. The one that comes to mind most usually is, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than your philosophy knows of. What he does not have, by his own admission, several times he admits it, is the spiritual depth to get beyond his thought and deeper into the spiritual worlds. From there, he can find the conviction that he can do what he needs to do. It's clear that he trusts the Spirit and he trusts destiny, but he has to get to that Spirit in him. He has to get beyond, or deeper beyond the mind. We know that he has that capacity to do that because he can sometimes look at his own thought and the thinking of other people that is clearly from a vantage that is above and beyond thinking. You know, when you're trying to develop spiritually, it's not one day you transcend and then it's all done. We get little glimpses, and sometimes we are in control of ourselves from beyond in the spirit, and sometimes we're not. Hamlet clearly follows the lines of linear, concrete thought, and he does it both in jest and in seriousness. We know that he's capable of ideation, or of abstract thought, where one knows one's own spiritual self and unspeakably divine things. We know this because of his profuse use of analogy, and especially the analogy of a play within a play, which is a pretty sophisticated idea. It's the whole principle of as above, so below, the principle of analogy. Begin to think of yourself sitting and watching this play, and watching the players in the play watch a play. You begin to understand that what we're in has many, many levels of depth and broadness. Now, in Midsummer Night's Dream, the reaction to the play within the play exposed the boorish conceit and the arrogance of the aristocrats. In Hamlet, viewing the play within a play exposed the guilt of Claudius, among other things. Now, drama has been used by the mystery schools as part of initiation for thousands of years. It is not so much used in the modern mystery schools, but we can't go into that right now. In the ancient mystery dramas that were used for initiation, plays were used, and that they served an additional function. Now, initiation is a two-phase activity, and that biphasal activity is a miniature of life. It is a play within a play, and it is the miniature of the cycles in which we evolve, the cycle of rebirth, of life and death, and even on a grand scale, the cycle of evolutionary creation. There are two phases in this cycle, two major phases. One is cathartic and purgatorial, as it was for Claudius. In that phase, the spirit releases, absorbs, and assimilates the soul power that is bound up in experience, in unredeemed deeds. In the second phase, one uses this newly released soul energy or spiritual energy to work out or to act out or to create some aspects of divine living. Many initiates become healers with the soul power that they have derived from the first phase of their initiation. Hamlet represents modern humanity and the modern spiritual aspirant. He is like modern humans, which since the time of Shakespeare have dived even more deeply, more dangerously into materialism. He has plenty of material depth, but he does not have sufficient spiritual depth for a full awakening and a full empowerment where the spirit can rule. He is clearly, by his own admission, world-weary, and he's eager for higher things. And it's unusual, but 3 times in this play, at least that I can recall, he talks about praying or higher kinds of meditation or things like that. He needs to get beyond his thoughts to the truth that is embodied in thoughts without the thoughts themselves. He thinks this is reality, even though he has been shocked out of this superstition that the material world is reality. So he still needs spiritual depth, and he still is being depressed deeper and deeper until he can come to that. So we can see here that not only is this a question of is he insane or not insane, or what makes sanity or insanity, it's a question also of becoming a divine being. That's involved in here. In fact, very often initiates at certain stages in their development were considered by the general populace to be insane. This is really a very good play, because the character of Hamlet as it is developed is so subtle and so ambiguous, so that no matter how long we've known this play, it leaves us just like him, in ambiguity and uncertainty, unless we ourselves can reach to that spiritual level that transcends thought. We don't know for certain what he is. We don't know for certain what we are. So we have been suckered into a play within ourselves. Hamlet is subtle enough that we don't know whether he is an ordinary person and just a bit eccentric, or whether he's outright crazy, or whether he's at the edge of initiation, or just a very clever feigner. Sometimes I feel like all of those every day in my own life. So this is really true to us. Thus, with this said, we haven't answered a lot of the many questions that we have before us. To some extent, we have answered what kind of behavior produces melancholy by reviewing the different factors of his melancholy and going a little deeper with that. Now hopefully we'll be able to go further in that direction. If we try to answer the question, is Hamlet a real character or a potential real character with psychologic, the answer is affirmative. We have seen now that each of these causes of depression shown in the play is logical and psychological. So there's no trouble there. The question becomes, can these causes all develop within the same personality? Are they mutually compatible instead of mutually exclusive? Is any combination of them possible? My answer to that is that they are not only a possible combination, but that they are a likely combination. I have seen these combinations in many people, though perhaps not as brilliant as Hamlet. I've seen them in a lot of people. To see how this is a likely personality conception, let's return to two of our other questions. And when we do, we will attempt to answer one and only one. The other one we'll leave up to the listener, and we'll leave it with the artistic brilliancy of Shakespeare to leave that question ultimately unanswered. The two questions are, what is sanity, or what is insanity? And that's an answerable question which we will go into. And the other one is Hamlet insane? So let's go to work and try to answer the first question. In Rosicrucian Christian mysticism, the student is taught that insanity is a break in the pathway of consciousness between the spirit and the physical body. Insanity is a break in the pathway of consciousness between the spirit and the physical body of a human being. Since the philosophy of the Rosicrucians is founded in careful clairvoyant observations and cross-checking with a scientific method, it's worthy of our attention, especially since it answers so many questions. Now, before proceeding into this very abbreviated elucidation, it must be mentioned that it will be expressed only from a mechanical or form point of view and not from the story side of life. Preceding these talks on the dramas of Shakespeare, we had many talks on mythology. And in mythology, we understood psychology through the story, through the moral, through the character development of a story. Now we're going to look at the mechanics of our soul nature, our emotions, our thinking, all of those things, and we're not going to look at the stories that those mechanics work out. In order to have a healthy psychological understanding, you have to have both. You have to understand the mechanics, and we have the story of life, the story behind the entire creation. And if we are to be in harmony with it, we have to live that story out. Like all forms of mysticism, the Rosicrucians have found that the pathway of consciousness between the spirit, the truth knower, the spiritual entity, the God, so to speak, and the dense body is bidirectional. And the two directions are called the extroversive stream and the introversive stream. And they both follow the same riverbed, the same pathway. In the extroversive stream, the threefold spirit, the divinity, is filled with love and the creative urge to give. The divine spirit functioning as will and the life spirit functioning as imagination in their male-female union, conceive an idea, a creative idea. That idea, or the central to those kinds of ideas, is the human spirit, which is a self, or a thinker, or a spiritual ego in the higher sense of the word with a capital E. That is itself a conception, and it takes part in the conceptive process, and especially in the materialization of the creative impulse. It does this by concentrating or precipitating concrete thoughts out of the creative idea. This concrete thought has the quality of truth within it, and it has the spirit to control the process, and it directs everything else in the concrete realms. This concrete thought is propelled out of the concrete mind into the dense body, into the desire body, In the desire body and in the desire world, it is imbued with feeling and emotion and all the hues of feeling and desire that are appropriate to its expression. When that impulse, which is now a thought clothed in desire, needs to be expressed further, and there is sufficient creative intensity behind it, the creative impulse then is then plunged into the etheric subdivision of the physical world. There it picks up what we would call energy or vital life or things like that. It may end there. But if it is appropriate, and if there is sufficient creative will behind it, so that it is able to manifest in the chemical subdivision of the physical world, it does so. It does so through our dense physical bodies, which are a product of the chemical subdivision of the physical world. Sometimes just changes in the physical world itself. That is the extraversive stream. In the introversive stream, events or experiences occur in the outer world, in the chemical subdivision, and they come through our dense physical bodies. They are carried by the ethers into the etheric realm through the senses. And there they become living memories. And they're stored and or passed on to the desire body. In the desire body, they become impressions. And we experience the feel behind the experience, which we may not even at the time have noticed or even realized that it was there. And we feel the event. And we often feel it in terms of pain and pleasure and mood and things like that. This impression in the desire body is passed on to the concrete mind. And in the concrete mind, it is rethought. And when it is rethought, it is neutralized, and the truth that is in it and the experience of all the different stages in the extraversive and especially the introversive stream are extracted from it. When we rethink, it is the thinker, the self, the divine being in the ideational mind that is doing the rethinking. And so it absorbs the essence of the experience into the spirit. And that essence of experience is called soul material. And it is then unified and built into the human spirit with the parent idea. The idea that was there before manifestation, so that we see the experience as it was conceived before it was brought out to finality, and then we have the soul material built into that idea, which is then a completed idea. And the completed idea, because there's a lot that's unknown, which is why we have to go through the whole creative process in the first place, is much richer than the original idea. So the parent idea has to be there all the way, but it gets enriched by the process of absorption of soul. So, one experiences the intended and the actual meaning of what has happened, and they are both built into the spirit. Now this cycle is repeated on greater or lesser scale. Some, like if we're driving down the road in an automobile and we see a car coming from the other direction, but we want to pass the car in front of us going the same direction that we are, we do this many times a second before we come to judgment of whether we can pass the car or not. This is something that's going on in our consciousness almost instantaneously, the introversive and extroversive cycle. When you see athletes or musicians or someone like that doing remarkable things, there is, they're in touch with the process outgoing and incoming. Some cycles, or one scale of this, or some scales of this take millions of years. So the cycle is the modus operandi of cosmology. Some of the cycles are shallower. Some don't go all the way back to be pondered by the spirit. Some do not go the full circuit. And some are aborted. Some things that we take out or bring out or bring back in are done with great skill, and some are not done so well. Some experiences are intense and they're life-changing, and others are weak and vague. But nonetheless, it's all the same cycle. Now, if we conserve and culture our creative energy that is behind all of this, and if we're full-blooded in our expressions, and we've learned to do it by spiritual exercises, the pathway, the riverbed of the introversive and extroversive streams becomes very clear and very strong. And our activities are much more likely to be successful. And we become increasingly healthy, both psychologically and physically. If we are vain and egoistic and laid our creative impulses with an unnecessary extra layer of egoism, or if we lie and dissipate our creative energy, we become weak and unhealthy, all the way from the physical, all the way through our higher bodies. Now, there are two ways that psychic health is manifest. One, that they're both necessary to having psychic health. Balance. The second is follow through. So if we have psychological problems, it is either because we are imbalanced and we can't function properly, or we lack follow through. But in this, there are two factors that are behind the way we manifest or demanifest experience. One could be called libido. It could be called creative energy. It could be called life force. Some people call it Kundalini. Some people call it spinal fire. Whatever it is, the energy. The other is egoism or selfishness. At least this is as we're looking at it as part of the unhealth or health of Hamlet, and through that of all people. The libido is spiritual energy. It's called sexual energy, but it's more than just mere energy of sex. We each have a certain amount available to us from our past life experiences. We've learned to put more oomph into life or less. It seems to be, when seen in the inner body, it seems to be etheric, but it's actually composite. It's made of all of the stuff available to us. The etheric energy, desire, and thought stuff. It's more sexual in its expression if it is activated in the lower center of creativity. That is the nucleus, the inner nucleus that is in the area of the sacrum and the genitals. It is more sacred and it is more spiritual if it is activated in the upper center of creativity, which in the inner body is the nucleus around the voice box and the brain. So sort of like we got these two bright spots in our inner being. The energy is sacred and it's precious. Almost all of our zest for life depends on it. And most people have their given lot for one lifetime and that's it. Some people, you can expend it and greatly weaken yourself. In another way, the energy is neutral, just as electric energy is neutral. If we use a flashlight to rob someone, or if we use a flashlight to show the way for someone, the energy, electrical energy in that is neutral. The energy, I imagine that the salamanders that are involved in it don't like casting the light for a robber or something like that, but that's the way it is. The energy can be conserved, and it can be sublimated, and it can even be given magical empowerment. Even so, it has a neutral quality about it. The same energy is used in black magic as is used in white magic. If someone cannot contain it, but tries and is sexually distracted, it almost always results in psychic illness. But it's not the energy that's at fault. The problem is in the other factor, the ego factor, the controlling agency. If this is really obvious, if you go to a mental institution and go into one of the large wards where the patients are strolling around at ease, it's very easy with the least little interaction to see that there is both ego problem and a sexual problem. Freud was a brilliant man in many ways, but you don't have to be brilliant to see that that's the case. You see that there is very largely a sexual problem. And that's because there's been too much preoccupation on that lower center and not enough on the higher. There are probably fewer psychological problems with spending the spiritual energy than there are with abstinence. Abstinence can give you rare powers and abilities, but it's a very tricky path. It's what we as spiritual students try to do, but it's not really simple. At least when it is expressed, the person gets drained. At least when it's expressed, the person develops more responsibilities. And one has the consequences of one's deeds that have to be worked out. However, if one dabs it up one way or another and does not have creative magical abilities or some way of projecting it and using it, it builds up immensely. And if one is not having an active thinking life, it stagnates and all sorts of things sprout up inside. This is why it always has been said that the holy elixir is the most potent poison if one is unprepared. If one is unselfish and has good self-control and develops creative abilities and is trained, the life of constancy or continency and chastity is a blessing. Now, the ways the creative force can be used improperly or impeded or disoriented or repressed or unconsciously metamorphized or misdirected are legion. There are many, many ways. However, they follow one of two major modes. Sigmund Freud was very bright, and many of his findings, though clothed in very seemingly deep concepts, are not really profound. Let's take an example from him. Sigmund Freud said coitus interruptus produces neurosis. When the powerful agency available to a human being is expressed in a very instinctual activity, procreation or survival of the species, it's not surprising that it would be jarring and impairing to one's self-image if it were interrupted. It's easy to see that there could be like a psychic disturbance. Now, the example of coitus interruptus is a dramatic example. One of the more dramatic examples that most people experience or have experienced in life. There are less dramatic examples and a myriad of little examples of things that we intend to do and may even start but do not carry out. When a stream of energy does not follow through, it is lost. It isn't lost. It is merely expressed in other ways. For example, a creative impulse can be broken into little behaviors, and those little behaviors become habitual, and they become complexes and even little entities in the aura. And by feeding them again and again, by not following through, they grow in strength. And ultimately, they can actually even challenge the lower nature or the personal ego because it gets stronger. In such a person, sometimes everything goes into the lower nature and the person becomes divided. And then the spiritual selfhood is apart from its reflection, the pseudo-self and the personality that is to be its junior partner. This results in a character fractionation. This is what Hamlet's saying. When he's saying, it wasn't I that killed Polonius, it was my insanity that killed Polonius. Meaning to say that the spirit, the rational part, the thinker, or this creative being was not functioning within the personality because from lack of follow-through, it had built it into a monster that had its own way of thinking, even though it didn't have a selfhood. The self is in, works through, and knows itself through the extroversive and introversive cycles. So if it halts the cycle, or if the pseudo-ego, the personal ego, gets too strong and disobedient and halts the cycle, and we don't carry out our good intentions, or it deflects it into something else, there is damage. There's damage in the whole soul nature. Now, it's possible for these energies not only to be distracted, it's possible for them to be repressed. On the other hand, if for some reason the self or even the personal ego favors selfishly or accentuates one function of the introversive or extroversive cycle over the other functions, it causes stress, and it can misshape the psyche by distension or by destructive diminution. It is not getting the feed that it needs. Suppose someone prefers thinking and feeling, but that person disdains action and is tepid about material experience. That describes a personality profile. And if the likes and or dislikes are extreme and sustained, it describes an unhealthy personal profile, an unbalanced personal profile. If the distension and the denial become habitual, and they are severe enough, it constitutes psychic ill health. Not necessarily insanity, but psychic ill health. In such a case, the experience of the cycle, the experience of reality, is distorted by imbalance or impedition, because there isn't something there that can function for it to work. In such a case, a person cannot express in the outer world in a fluent manner. And a person can't draw from the experience in the outer world in a fluid manner. If there is an extreme, such as the extreme materialism that we have where everything is focused in the physical body, the psyche or the soul can be, so to speak, stretched or pinched by imbalance. The stretching is not quite like stretching the elastic band on the underwear, and it's not like pinching a hose closed or something like that. Those are lovely metaphors, but they give us an idea of what's involved, so that the flow is stopped or that it just bellies out in one way or another. Now, this is all extremely brief, and it's almost dangerously simplified, but it is a simple view of showing how a neurosis can develop through lack of follow-through or lack of balance, whether it is in introversion or in extroversion. Now, these are things that don't happen overnight. It takes often a very long time, even within one life, but usually between several lives. Whether it's by lack of follow-through or whether it is by preferential imbalance, when the energy is not carried out, it finds other expression. And it usually finds expression not in creative imagination, but in its stepsister, fantasy. It has to go somewhere, so that by the time we realize that someone is in trouble psychologically or that there are a lot of psychological problems, things have been so complicated and there are so many layers of fantasy and fantasies within other fantasies that the personal ego working through them almost usurps the control. It usurps the control, and the self, the divine being, is not in control at all. And the lower nature loves to revel in desire and so there's all of that wild craziness that is a consequence of imbalance or lack of follow-through. Now, Hamlet exhibits all of these complexities except fantasy. He has no fantasy at all. So that is the only thing that I find in reading this play that is not psychologically as one would expect. Now, in a neurosis, it's surprising how instituting little things that restore balance or that restore follow-through can help. It's just like when Hamlet tells his mother, "Stay away from the bed tonight, and tomorrow it will be easier." If you do little things and follow through on them, just the simplest little habits, you develop strength, and pretty soon you have a good follow-through. And if you learn to like the things you don't have and establish balance in your character that way, it's something that wonders can be done. And in that, a lot of problems can be averted and a person can become psychologically healthy. But when the stretching and or the impedition to the flow, whether inward or outward, gets so great that it causes a break in the pathway of consciousness between the spirit and the physical body, the result is insanity. A break, large or small, is a break. It's not a stretching. It's not a twisting. Insanity is at least a partial inability to get through to the physical world or to get information from the physical world. The break might be small or it might be large. It may be like just the breaking of one little strand in a cable, or maybe the entire cable itself will break. Trained seers claim if there is indeed a break, it cannot be repaired. The individual has to await until there is a new rebirth where it can start out all together from the very basic fundamentals of producing a new set of bodies and start all over again. Because it's not something, it's not like splicing wires together. That's not possible. So that what is true insanity in terms of mysticism is something that is pretty severe. And being able to diagnose from our point of view here in our blindness in the chemical subdivision of the physical world, it's a really hard thing to do. There are all sorts of things that seem like insanity. Possession, for example, seems like insanity. It seems like there are two beings in there rather than a higher and lower self. There really are two beings in there, and that's something very different. Plus, we have all sorts of things like entities that we have created in past lives that can come back and divide our attention. It is said that people who have extremely desireful lives build desire bodies that are not broken down by purgatory or first heaven, and they come back and they try to assert themselves in the next life, and you have a very divided person like a schizophrenic. Unless one is a very good, well-trained seer, the determination of sanity or insanity is very, very difficult. So you can see that there may be different varieties, but it's clear-cut that there is one insanity. That is a break. There only needs to be one break, and you can't, another break can't be made because the stream has been interrupted. Sometimes if a person has very good intuition or works with invisible helpers or something like that, you can make a determination of insanity, but it is not easy otherwise. The strain or a break in the pathway of consciousness can happen anywhere along the way. It can happen between bodies, like, say, between the desire body and the vital body. That happens frequently there. And it can happen between different regions within a body. Hence, the variety of structural possibilities of insanity, without going into the story behind it, is huge. And each variety has its own characteristics. For many years I've had a desire to work together with a psychiatrist or a researcher to take the symptoms of the various major different kinds of psychological maladies and associate them with the different regions of the different bodies and what the consequences are. But I'm not sure that I'm going to get the opportunity to do that in this life. So there are a lot of possibilities. If it is a severe break and the spirit is separated from its vehicles, from its own concrete mind, that's about as severe as you can get. We won't go into that, but it's really something. But if there's a break between the mind and the desire body, what is left behind on the material side is like an animal. It has raging emotions, and it has energy and a physical form, but it just doesn't have the mind and the spirit working through the mind to control it. If the break is between the desire body and the vital body, what is left behind is something like a vegetable. There's no motivation, there's no thought, and the spirit isn't behind it. It has an etheric nature and it has a physical nature. So in folk language, when we say that this person is a vegetable, people don't realize how close they are to describing the reality. Now those are extreme breaks. They're very rare. And the rarest of all, the breaking of the whole cable, that is where the spiritual divine being can no longer express in any of its vehicles, is very, very, very rare. Suppose there's a lot of stress in the lowest region of the desire body, which is the Saturnian region, due to some kind of egoism. And suppose that interacts with the highest part of the vital body, the reflecting ether. Then you have those selfish, insecure, saturnine desires and all of those deductive chains that can take place in the reflecting ether. And you have those paranoid kinds of streams of thought, or what appear to be thoughts. There's a lot of suspicions and all things like that. Okay, this gives us a little of an idea of insanity, and we can now move forward. So for a moment, let's turn to Hamlet. His case is difficult because he does seem to be seeking spiritually along initiate lines, and that always accelerates or exaggerates everything in our lives. If we're truly living a spiritual life, our life is amplified. People with psychological help, with psychological problems often do seek the higher life because they know that's the only way they can really be healed. An actual initiate is extremely well trained in everything, in thinking, in emoting, and in acting and sensing. Yes, somebody like the great poet Goethe was active in all of those things. He was a marvel at everything. He's very deeply thoughtful, and he was capable of looking out of one little window in his study and seeing one cloud and knowing what the weather was going to be like the next day because he had that keen of an observation. Now, Hamlet has intuition that's like mind reading. And he's so much in the mind that that's the vehicle that he uses for it. And he speaks from mystical philosophy, it almost seems. But he does have problems that are beyond amplification and exaggeration in his consciousness. Not only into the to be or not to be speech, but throughout he lacks follow-through. He's imbalanced in that he's in the mind, and he lacks follow-through. He can't carry out his charge. And the moral rightness or wrongness of the deed, as he ponders them, distract him more. He really is distracted, and that's even by his own description. He's imbalanced. He loves thought over emotion. And he loves both over physical satisfaction. Certainly, by the mind, a dark Saturnian mind, he does suppress his emotion. And he shows his deliberate love later on. So you can see that I don't know how to say it. It's in his control and not in his control. He also has repressed anger in his vengeance, and he seems to repress love and a lot of other feelings. And by his own admission, in at least two places in the play, he cannot get deep enough into the spirit to fulfill his destiny. He is shallow in his faith. Even in the face of psychic phenomena, he has spiritual doubts. He has symptoms of several roots of depression. He has two major symptoms of psychological trouble: lack of follow-through and imbalance. Some would even go so far as to say that the ghost was a delusional fantasy and that he is crazy. However, he does not have a lot of vanity. And that vanity is usually the ultimate impediment. That vanity gives strength to the divided self, to the lower nature of the divided self. He has enough vanity to be held captive in his own mind, but he's not a really completely vain person. He couldn't be as generous as he is even to his rival Laertes. Humility is the opposite of insanity. Because if a person is humble, there is no obstruction to the flow either way. There is no prejudicial observation, and there is no holding back from loving. In humble recognition and submission of the personal ego in service of the divine or spiritual self, one opens that flow up. That's healthy and that's healing. There is no limit to humility. One can be brought ever more clear and open. One can be more and more humble. If you look at somebody like Mother Teresa, wow, did she have a lot of humility, and she had great spiritual insights at the same time. So, we can look over the list of major and minor symptoms. We can see what is insane and what isn't. We can see that there are various varieties of insanity depending on where the break is, and we can see that one can, by greater humility and greater spiritual unfolding, can be more and more sane. But we still have the question of, is Hamlet insane? As far as I'm concerned, there are a lot of factors to indicate either way. But I won't tell you the conclusion that I come to about it. I have satisfied myself on that matter. But if I told you my conclusion, I might be influencing your judgment. And we study these things to be able to judge for ourselves and see the truth for ourselves. All right, next time we'll start going into the deeper things, the more mythological side of Hamlet. Thank you very much.